Above in the sky, the passenger airliner shook violently as the left engine billowed thick black smoke. Passengers screamed in terror, flight attendants panicked, and the captain lay unconscious in the cockpit. In the chaos, a female passenger quietly stepped into the pilot's cabin without hesitation. No one believed she could do anything until the radio crackled with her decisive voice. "This is Valkyrie, taking control." Immediately, escorting F-22s broke their stunned radio silence in complete amazement. Elena Marquez settled into seat 23A of Flight 447 from Denver to Seattle, her worn backpack tucked beneath the seat in front of her with the same methodical precision she applied to everything in her life. At 30, her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance made her nearly invisible among the business travelers and vacation passengers who filled the Boeing 737's cabin. She worked as a civilian aerospace engineer for a government contractor, spending most of her time in sterile office buildings reviewing technical specifications and safety protocols that kept commercial aviation functioning safely. To her fellow passengers, she was just another professional traveler whose presence barely registered in their awareness. "Excuse me, miss," said the businessman in 23B, his tone carrying the casual condescension that frequent flyers often showed toward people they perceived as less important. "Could you help me with my laptop bag? You look like you could use the exercise." Elena smiled politely and helped him arrange his belongings, her assistance received as confirmation of his assumption that she existed primarily to make his travel experience more comfortable. The businessman returned to his phone calls without acknowledgement, already having categorized her as forgettable support staff. Throughout the boarding process, Elena's kindness manifested in small gestures that went largely unnoticed. When an elderly gentleman struggled to lift his carry-on into the overhead compartment, she quietly helped him without being asked. When a young mother traveling alone with twin toddlers looked overwhelmed, Elena offered to help secure the children's safety belts and entertainment devices. "Thank you so much," the mother whispered gratefully. "Most people just pretend not to see when you need help with kids." Elena's response was characteristically modest. "Children should feel safe when they fly," she said quietly, her words carrying weight that seemed inconsistent with casual conversation between strangers. The flight attendants who worked the aircraft knew Elena as a regular passenger on this route, someone who always chose window seats and spent most flights reading technical manuals that seemed far too complex for casual interest. They appreciated her politeness, but had never given much thought to what kind of work required such intensive study of aviation systems. "She's so quiet," observed Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, during their pre-flight briefing. "Always reading those thick engineering books. Probably works for Boeing or something equally boring." Hidden in Elena's backpack was a patch that told a different story entirely. Kraken Wing, Valkyrie, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve between technical manuals and safety documentation. The worn fabric represented experiences that her current life as a civilian engineer couldn't accommodate or acknowledge. Her transition to civilian aerospace work had been voluntary exile, chosen after military experiences that had broken something inside her that peacetime couldn't repair, but that civilian engineering work might slowly heal. The commercial aviation industry offered purpose without the psychological pressure of combat operations or the burden of life and death decisions that affected entire squadrons. As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, Elena noticed details that other passengers missed. Slight variations in engine sound, minor changes in cabin pressure, small adjustments in the aircraft's attitude that indicated normal flight operations proceeding exactly as designed. During the beverage service, the elderly gentleman she had helped with his luggage struck up a conversation, curious about the technical manuals she was reading. "My dear, those look like very serious books," he said, his voice carrying the gentle curiosity that retirement had given him time to express. "Are you studying to become a pilot?" Elena looked up from her review of emergency procedures documentation, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed inconsistent with her quiet engineering role. "Don't worry," she said quietly. her voice carrying certainty that came from experience rather than theory. I'm more familiar with engine sounds than my own heartbeat. The elderly gentleman smiled, thinking it was just reassuring conversation from someone trying to calm his flying anxieties. He had no way of knowing that he was speaking to someone whose understanding of aviation extended far beyond civilian engineering specifications. Years later, the elderly gentleman would tell his grandchildren, "She said quietly, 'Don't worry, I'm more familiar with engine sounds than my own heartbeat.' I thought she was just being comforting at the time." The crisis began at 31,000 feet when Flight 447's left engine suffered a catastrophic failure that sent shockwaves through the aircraft and created immediate emergency conditions that tested every system designed to keep commercial aviation safe. The explosion was visible through the cabin windows, a burst of flame and metal debris that transformed routine air travel into a life-threatening emergency. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, as asymmetric thrust created control problems that challenged the flight crew's ability to maintain level flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mechanical difficulties," came Captain Morrison's voice over the intercom. But passengers could hear the strain beneath his professional calm as warning alarms screamed in the cockpit behind him. Within minutes, the situation deteriorated beyond standard emergency procedures. Captain Morrison collapsed from what appeared to be a stress-induced cardiac episode, leaving First Officer Davis to handle an emergency that exceeded his training and experience with a critically damaged aircraft. "This is Flight 447 declaring emergency." Davis's voice crackled through aviation frequencies, desperation evident despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. "We have engine failure and medical emergency. Request immediate assistance." In the cabin, panic spread like wildfire as passengers processed the reality of their situation. Children cried, adults prayed, and the normal social boundaries that governed air travel disappeared under the pressure of shared mortality. That's when Elena unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movement calm and purposeful despite the aircraft's erratic flight path. "Where are you going?" demanded the businessman from 23B, his earlier condescension replaced by panic that made him grab at anyone who seemed to have a plan. "Sit down before you get hurt." Jennifer, the senior flight attendant, intercepted Elena as she moved toward the front of the aircraft. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately. We're in an emergency situation." But Elena didn't stop. "I need to get to the cockpit," she said quietly, her voice carrying authority that seemed inconsistent with her passenger status. "I can help with the aircraft." The reaction from other passengers was immediate and dismissive. "She's just an engineer," shouted someone from the back of the cabin. "What does she think she can do that trained pilots can't?" Flight Attendant Martinez joined the effort to keep Elena in the passenger area. "Ma'am, the cockpit is restricted to flight crew only. Please return to your seat and let the professionals handle this." But Elena had already assessed the situation with systematic precision that indicated experience far beyond civilian engineering work. The engine failure pattern, the aircraft's response to control inputs, and the first officer's stress level all pointed to scenarios she had trained for in circumstances that commercial aviation rarely encountered. "I'm going to help," she said simply, her words carrying finality that made Jennifer step aside, despite every protocol she'd been taught about passenger management during emergencies. Elena entered the cockpit to find First Officer Davis struggling with controls that no longer responded according to normal procedures. The instrument panel showed multiple system failures, and the aircraft was slowly losing altitude despite his best efforts to maintain flight parameters. "Ma'am, you can't be here," Davis said, his voice carrying panic that professional training couldn't suppress. "This is a restricted area during emergency operations." But Elena was already studying the instrument displays with systematic attention that indicated intimate familiarity with aircraft systems under emergency conditions. "What's your fuel status?" she asked, her question delivered with authority that made Davis respond automatically. "Approximately 40 minutes remaining," he replied, then caught himself. "Wait, who are you? How do you know about fuel management?" Instead of answering, Elena began conducting what appeared to be advanced systems analysis, her hands moving across controls with confidence that belonged in military aviation rather than civilian passenger service. "Engine 1 shut down, crossfeed active," she said, using terminology that made Davis freeze in recognition of expertise that seemed impossible given her passenger status. "Ma'am," he said slowly, processing implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about the situation. Have you flown before?" Elena looked at the first officer whose training had prepared him for standard emergencies, but not for the combination of system failures and crew incapacitation that now threatened everyone on board. "I need to take the controls," she said quietly, her words carrying weight that transformed the cockpit atmosphere from panic to focused determination. As she settled into the captain's seat, Elena activated the radio with movements that indicated muscle memory rather than recent training. "This is Valkyrie taking control." Her voice cut through aviation frequencies with calm authority that seemed to come from deep experience rather than emergency improvisation. The response was immediate and electrifying. Military aircraft monitoring civilian frequencies suddenly became very interested in Flight 447's emergency, not because of the technical problems, but because of a call sign that hadn't been heard in military aviation circles for 3 years. First Officer Davis stared at Elena with growing understanding that the passenger he had tried to exclude from the cockpit was demonstrating capabilities that belonged in classified military programs, rather than civilian air travel. Years later, First Officer Davis would write in his aviation memoir, "The moment I heard the word Valkyrie, I got chills. That was a call sign that only existed in Kraken Wing legend." Elena's hands moved across the aircraft controls with precision that transformed Flight 447 from a barely controllable emergency into a manageable flight situation. Despite having only one functional engine and multiple system failures, she began executing maneuvers that seemed to defy the limitations imposed by the aircraft's damaged condition. "Seattle Center, this is Valkyrie with Flight 447. Her voice cut through radio traffic with professional calm that belonged in military operations rather than civilian emergency response. "Single engine operation, requesting priority approach to nearest suitable airport." But the response that came back through the aviation frequencies made everyone listening understand that something extraordinary was happening above the Pacific Northwest. "Valkyrie, this is Raptor Flight," came the voice of an F-22 pilot whose squadron had been conducting training exercises in the area. "Confirm your call sign. Are you really Valkyrie?" The question rippled through military aviation channels as controllers and pilots processed the implications of a call sign that had been legendary in fighter pilot communities before disappearing from active duty under circumstances that remained classified. Elena's response was brief, but carried weight that transformed her from emergency passenger to military aviation history in real time. "Raptor Flight, affirmative. I'm a little busy right now." In the cabin behind her, passengers who had dismissed her as just another engineer now gripped their armrests as the aircraft executed maneuvers that seemed impossible given their emergency condition. Elena was flying the damaged Boeing 737 with precision that belonged in fighter pilot training rather than commercial aviation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Valkyrie," came Elena's voice over the passenger address system, her slight hesitation reflecting the strange reality of using her military call sign in civilian aircraft operations. "We're going to make an emergency landing. Please follow flight attendant instructions and prepare for impact." But what happened next would be remembered in aviation circles for decades. Elena brought the crippled aircraft down through weather conditions that should have made landing impossible, using techniques that push both pilot skill and aircraft capability to their absolute limits. "Flight 447, you are cleared for emergency landing runway 16 left," came the voice from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, where emergency crews had positioned themselves for what everyone expected to be a catastrophic crash landing. Elena's approach was so precisely controlled that observers on the ground couldn't tell the aircraft was operating on a single engine until they saw the damaged wing configuration. She compensated for asymmetric thrust with control inputs that required understanding of aerodynamics that went far beyond commercial pilot training. Raptor Flight, this is Valkyrie. Her voice came through military frequencies as she continued her approach. Thanks for the escort. High above Flight 447, a formation of F-22 fighters had quietly taken positions to provide whatever assistance might be possible during the emergency landing. Their pilots, understanding that they were witnessing something that connected civilian aviation to military aviation history. The landing was executed with precision that seemed impossible given the aircraft's condition. Elena touched down with control that made the emergency landing look routine, despite single-engine operation and multiple system failures that should have made survival impossible. When Flight 447 finally rolled to a stop on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and rescue personnel, the cabin erupted in cheers and tears as passengers processed their survival of what should have been a fatal accident. But Elena was already completing post-flight procedures with systematic attention that indicated training far beyond civilian aviation requirements. First Officer Davis watched with growing amazement as she secured systems and documented the emergency with military precision. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice filled with respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the emergency. "Who are you really?" Elena looked at the first officer whose life she had just saved along with everyone else on board the aircraft, her expression carrying depths that made her civilian engineering work seem like elaborate cover rather than career choice. "I'm Elena Marquez, aerospace engineer," she said quietly, her words carrying truth that didn't tell the complete story. "And sometimes I'm Valkyrie." The implications rippled through everyone who heard the conversation. Valkyrie wasn't just a call sign. It was a reputation built on fighter pilot missions that had become part of military training curricula before the pilot disappeared from active duty after a classified mission that had cost Kraken Wing everything. As passengers began evacuating the aircraft, many stopped to thank Elena for saving their lives. The businessman from 23B who had dismissed her as forgettable support staff found himself unable to speak as he processed how completely he had misjudged someone whose capabilities extended far beyond his ability to comprehend. The elderly gentleman she had helped with his luggage approached her with tears in his eyes, his voice thick with emotion that a lifetime of experience couldn't suppress. "My dear, I don't know how to thank you," he said, his words carrying gratitude that extended beyond personal survival to recognition of extraordinary competence revealed under impossible circumstances. Elena's response reflected the humility that had always characterized her approach to both military and civilian service, even when that service involved capabilities that most people couldn't understand. "Sir, I didn't save anyone to be thanked," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that recognition was less important than the people who were going home to their families. "I flew because no one else could." Through the cockpit radio, the F-22 pilots who had escorted her emergency landing offered recognition that connected her civilian heroism to her military service record. "Valkyrie, this is Raptor Flight," came the formal transmission that everyone on aviation frequencies could hear. "The sky is yours." The phrase carried weight that transcended normal aviation courtesy, representing acknowledgement from active military pilots that they had just witnessed something that belonged in aviation history rather than routine emergency response. Elena removed her headset and prepared to leave the aircraft as just another passenger, but everyone who had been on board Flight 447 would remember the day when someone they had overlooked revealed capabilities that saved all their lives. If you believe that one call sign can make the entire sky bow down, type in the comments, "I owe a debt." Elena walked through the terminal at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with the same quiet efficiency she had shown before the emergency, declining every interview request and avoiding the media attention that followed major aviation incidents. She carried her worn backpack and moved through crowds of reporters and curious observers as if she were just another passenger continuing her journey. The airline's crisis management team wanted to schedule press conferences and recognition ceremonies. But Elena had already boarded a different flight to her final destination, leaving behind only the mystery of how a civilian passenger had possessed the skills to execute one of the most successful emergency landings in commercial aviation history. "We still don't know who she really is," said the lead investigator from the National Transportation Safety Board, reviewing flight data that showed piloting techniques far beyond normal civilian training. The passenger manifest lists Elena Marquez, aerospace engineer, but those weren't civilian flying skills. Within hours, word had reached military aviation communities where Valkyrie's call sign carried legendary status. Fighter pilots who had trained using her tactical innovations began sharing stories that connected the emergency landing to military aviation history that most civilians would never understand. The next morning's headlines read, "Unknown passenger saved flight. F-22s saluted her call sign." But the articles contained more questions than answers about how someone with military pilot capabilities had been traveling as a civilian passenger. More importantly, the incident began changing conversations about assumptions and recognition in ways that extended far beyond aviation. Flight attendants who had tried to keep Elena in the passenger area during the emergency began questioning their own judgments about people's capabilities based on appearance and job titles. "I almost prevented her from saving everyone's lives," Jennifer told her family that evening, her voice carrying shame at how close she had come to enforcing regulations that would have killed everyone on board. "She looked like just another quiet passenger, and I never imagined she could be a military pilot." The passengers from Flight 447 began reaching out to each other through social media, creating a community bound together by shared survival and growing understanding of how completely they had misjudged someone whose quiet competence had saved all their lives. The businessman from 23B posted a public apology on LinkedIn. "I treated someone as if she existed to serve me, when she actually existed to save me. I will never make assumptions about people based on how they look again." That evening, Elena sat alone in her apartment, holding the Kraken wing patch that connected her current civilian work to the military aviation service that had defined her understanding of duty and sacrifice. The patch represented experiences that civilian life couldn't accommodate, but that had proven essential when people needed skills that only military training could provide. "Miguel," she whispered to the memory of her fallen wingman, her voice barely audible in the small space that contained both her civilian life and her military memories. "Today I kept another sky safe." The emergency landing had revealed her identity to anyone who understood military aviation history, but it had also demonstrated that her transition to civilian life hadn't eliminated her capabilities. It had simply redirected them toward protecting people in different circumstances. Outside her window, commercial aircraft continued their routine flights, their passengers never knowing that someone with military fighter pilot training might be sitting quietly in seat 23A, reading technical manuals and helping elderly passengers with their luggage while carrying skills that could save everyone on board if circumstances required it. Type, "I will live respectfully," if you believe that true heroes never need applause. This isn't just a story about an emergency landing that revealed hidden capabilities. It's a reminder that we live in a world where extraordinary people often choose the most ordinary appearances, where military-trained professionals transition to civilian roles without advertising their backgrounds, and where the person sitting next to you on any flight might carry skills that could save your life if disaster struck. Elena Marquez's story teaches us something profound about the nature of service and the assumptions we make about people based on their current roles, rather than their complete life experience. Her choice to work as a civilian aerospace engineer wasn't a step down from military aviation. It was a conscious decision to continue serving while processing experiences that civilian life could accommodate better than continued military service. Around the world, former military pilots work in civilian aviation, defense contractors, and aerospace companies, their advanced training benefiting industries that rarely acknowledge the depth of expertise being applied to routine problems. They choose civilian roles not from inability to continue military service, but from understanding that their skills can serve society in multiple contexts. Military aviation training creates capabilities that don't disappear when pilots transition to civilian careers. The precision, crisis management skills, and ability to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure continue to inform every aspect of their civilian work, often in ways that colleagues and passengers never recognize or appreciate. Elena's emergence from civilian passenger to emergency pilot represents something deeper than hidden talent. It symbolizes the moment when all of someone's training reveals itself in response to genuine need. These revelations happen more often than we realize, usually in contexts that don't involve commercial aircraft emergencies and F-22 recognition. Every day, former military personnel use skills learned in extreme circumstances to solve civilian problems, often without anyone understanding the depth of experience being applied to routine challenges. Their training benefits communities, companies, and industries in ways that remain largely invisible until crisis situations require capabilities that only military experience can provide. The assumptions that nearly prevented Elena from entering the cockpit represent all the limitations we place on people based on their appearance, their job titles, or their quiet demeanor. How many times do we dismiss someone's offer to help because it doesn't match our expectations of who should be capable of what? The next time you encounter someone who offers assistance in a way that seems beyond their apparent qualifications, remember Elena Marquez. Remember that competence doesn't always announce itself with appropriate credentials, that military training often hides behind civilian job titles, and that the most extraordinary people frequently choose the most modest presentations. Maybe tomorrow you'll sit next to someone quiet on a flight, someone reading technical manuals while helping other passengers. Don't assume they're just being nice, because you never know when the person you're overlooking carries exactly the skills needed to bring everyone home safely with a call sign that makes fighter jets break radio silence in recognition of capabilities that saved your life. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.